Good evening. Welcome to the Association for the Study of African American Life and History, Know Before You Go, a part of our Social Justice Thursday event. And tonight we're going to hear about Eating While Black. I want to thank you for joining us tonight. And I want to let you know a few things that we'd like for you to do during this webinar. So first, we'd like for you to look at the chat button and use it liberally. Please introduce yourself in the chat and also have a conversation. We'll have folks here monitoring the chat, and some of that may become a part of our discussion later in the conversation. Also, if you have specific questions, please use the question and answer button. In the question and answer area, we will see your questions and we will deliver it to the panelists at the right time during the session. And so what I'd like for you to do is to know that for the next 2 weeks, we're looking forward to you joining us for these sessions, these pre-conference book series, leading up to the conference, the 107th ASALH Annual Conference in Montgomery, Alabama. Social Justice Thursday will be the first day in person at the conference. And so we hope that these webinars and those that you'll see personally in ASALH will help you with your growth and learning. Social Justice at ASALH is an interdisciplinary initiative that includes workshops, outreach materials, and fellowships focused on social justice community engagement. This series is brought to you by Howard University Social Justice Consortium, made possible by the Mellon Just Futures Initiative. I want to thank you for joining us tonight. We hope you enjoy this session and you'll join us next week and at the ASALH conference. I would like to now welcome Mr. W. Marvin Dulaney, PhD and President of ASALH. Marvin, would you please join us with some remarks?
Thank you, Michelle. I am, as Michelle pointed out, Marvin Dulaney, a retired history professor and president of the Association for the Study of African American Life and History. As you heard, we use the acronym of ASALH for our organization. As she also pointed out, we are 2 weeks away from hosting our 107th annual conference in Montgomery, Alabama. There's still time for you to join us at that conference, and trust me, you will definitely enjoy the workshops, the panels, the film sessions, the luncheon speakers, and you will leave the conference, trust me, very enriched. ASALH has long addressed social justice issues. In fact, our founder, Dr. Carter G. Woodson, started ASALH in 1915 as a result of social justice issues. Early 20th century America was filled with racism, discrimination, lynchings, and indeed all kinds of issues affecting the social justice for African Americans. So he founded the association as a way of not only, of course, marching in the streets and using the courts, but also using historical facts and details to challenge racist ideas, myths, and lies about African Americans. So Social Justice at ASALH provides free workshops and events, as you heard Michelle point out. It's an opportunity for ASALH and the Howard Social Justice Initiative Consortium to offer broad public programs and, of course, allow the community to participate in social justice. Today's program is an example. Today's program features Psyche Williams Forson, professor and department chair of American Studies at the University of Maryland, and most importantly for tonight's presentation, author of the book, Eating While Black, Food Shaming and Race in America. Moderator and curator of tonight's panel is LaShawn Harris, associate professor of history at Michigan State University, and assistant editor for the Journal of African American History, a Solace journal. She is also author of the prize-winning book, Sex Workers, Psychics, and Numbers Runners, Black Women in New York City's Underground Economy. So with that, let me now turn this over to LaShawn, who will provide panel introductions and lead us through tonight's workshop. Thank you.
Okay, everyone should mute themselves. Thank you, Dr. Dulaney, for that, that great introduction. Good evening, Asala, family and friends. Before we get started tonight, I would like to give a few shout outs and a few thank yous. Thank you, Professor Williams-Forson, for writing such a wonderful book. It's really a treat to read this book. I would also like to thank our panelists for agreeing to participate on the panel. I would like to thank Michelle Pousseau, Nicholas Hall, Christina Crawford, also the Mellon Justice Future Initiatives, Howard University, and Asala for hosting this wonderful event. Dr. Psyche Williams-Forson is a leading thinker of African-American culture and food in America. Eating While Black brilliantly explores how anti-Black racism and theory operate in the practice and culture of eating. According to Professor Williams-Forson, quote unquote, Eating While Black is concerned with how the current changing food world affects and is affected by African Americans. The book is designed to push conversations rather than provide answers, and it seeks to capitalize on a complex subject that is often made to be too simplistic by sound bites, the everydayness of food, and the popularity of reality television shows, which allows everyone to set themselves as an expert. End quote. Eating While Black concerns itself with the ways in which food shaming, whether through the lens of class, race, gender, or region, is used as a mechanism of control. Our featured panelists include Dr. Ashante Reese. Dr. Reese is an associate professor of African and African Diaspora Studies in the African and African Diaspora Studies Department at the University of Texas at Austin. She is the author of several award-winning books, including Black Food Geographies, Race, Self-Reliance, and Food Access in Washington, D.C., which was published by the University of North Carolina Press in 2019, and Black Food Matters, Racial Justice in the Wake of Food Justice, published by the University of Minnesota Press in 2020. Our next presenter is Chef Jafi Kabui. Chef Kabui is an award-winning chef with a passion for food justice. He is a leading expert in food literacy, a medical anthropologist, as well as an organic farmer. He is actively involved in promoting food literacy as a public speaker, as a blogger, as an author, and a social commentator. Jeff Kabui considers himself to be an organic chef who has designed his own disruptive cuisine. He calls this cuisine Afrofuturistic Conscious Cuisine, which promotes a mix of indigenous and healthy food for the sake of sovereignty, health, and justice. Our next speaker will be Jennifer Wallach. Jennifer Wallach is a professor of African American history and food studies at the University of North Texas. She is the author of more than 5 books on African American foodways, including How America Eats, A Social History of US Food and Culture, which was published in 2013. And more recently, a book entitled Every Nation Has Its Dish, Black Bodies and Black Food in 20th Century America, which was published by the University of North Carolina Press. And last, but definitely not least, Dr. Adrian Miller is a historian, lawyer, author, and public policy advisor. He is the author of the book, Soul Food, The Surprising Story of an American Cuisine, One Plate at a Time, which was awarded the 2014 James Beard Food Book Award for Reference and Scholarship. Miller's 2017 book, The President's Kitchen Cabinet, the story of African Americans who fed our first families from the Washingtons to the Obamas, was a 2018 nominee for the NAACP Image Award for Outstanding Nonfiction Literary Books. The full panelists' bios and professional and personal links will also be in the chat if you want to check out their full bios, as well as you want to purchase some of their books. So we will start with our first presenter, Dr. Reese.
Thank you so much, LaShawn, and for everybody for pulling this together. First of all, I have to say, Dr. Harris, thank you for calling that associate into the room. I am still assistant and going through tenure right now.
We're
And
speaking it into existence.
listen, we're gonna go ahead and claim that. So thank
Right.
you. Secondly, I want to just say by way of appreciation and introduction, a few days ago, I was working on this document that asks us to name our lineages, intellectual and otherwise. And in reflecting, in preparation for this, I was reflecting on that. And what a joy it's been to be a part of and include Psyche's work and being as a part of my lineage. Known her work for much longer, but have been able to consider her a mentor, a friend, and just someone with whom to practice Black feminist care and community making with for, I don't know, about 10 years now. So I just want to say that because I think it's important that the ways we think of people's intellectual work, at least for me, is also tied with how they are in the world. And she's just been such a wonderful friend and mentor. So thank you for that, Psyche. So I'm really excited to share a bit about her work. So I'm going to filter my comments through three lenses: scale, space, and the Black radical imagination. So number one, questioning scale. Over the past several years, I've spent much of my time thinking about food as a problem of scale. Questions about how to make sure everyone has access to affordable, culturally appropriate foods of their choice are also fundamentally questions about scale. Questions about supply chains that entered public conversations at more alarming rates during the pandemic are also questions about scale, and questions about how to quote unquote help people eat healthier, whether they are misdirected or not, are fundamentally about scale. And when I say scale here, I'm meaning the levels at which goals can be met or measured in ways that suggest success. And the more I think about scale, specifically scaling up, the more I'm convinced that scaling up is most often a white supremacist capitalist concept that requires surveillance. And as we see in Professor William Sforson's book, shaming as a form of social control. To put it succinctly, the problem with scaling up is that it requires a uniformity that denies one of the very facets of being human: cultural and social variation and difference. What Eating While Black instructs, and I would say challenges us to do, is to fundamentally question the scales at which narratives about Black suffering, Black joy, and Black health as related to food are told, and who's telling them. We would do well to question singular narratives that reify notions that Black people and Black foods need saving. Indeed, Professor William Sforson reminds us that these singular narratives are counter to the bountifulness that is present in Black ways of knowing and being. We are not a monolithic people, and scaling toward uniformity makes it that much easier for anti-Black racism to permeate notions of health and healthiness that we could define for ourselves. Number two, anti-Black racism, space, and food shaming. Throughout Eating While Black, there is the obvious theme of exploring food shaming as a manifestation of anti-Black racism. But one of the more subtle and equally compelling themes to me is the role space and place play and how shaming happens. Whether sitting in a room listening to a white woman presenter share historically inaccurate information about soul food, or listening to Eric Schlosser in an auditorium, who at best misses an opportunity to affirm Black women who cite his work as life-changing, or at worst capitalizes on an opportunity to put them in their place by critiquing their choices. Or while one is on a train minding her own business. What connects the examples is the way so-called public spaces, presumably equal to everyone, are primed for shaming. Catherine McKittrick's work demonstrates that one of the enduring contradictions of the relationship between Blackness and space is that Black people are thought to at once be fixed in place while also presumed placeless, meaning we belong nowhere. I see something similar playing out in Eating While Black. Professor Williams-Forson demonstrates for us across various spatial contexts and time periods that over and over again, Black people's food cultures are narrativized as fixed, unchanging, unidimensional, and in need of fixing, while Black people ourselves are often reminded of our placelessness in food cultures and otherwise through different forms of shaming. Essentially, what Professor Williams-Forson shows us is that food shaming is as much a spatial practice as it is interpersonal, political, and structural. And yet, this is not simply a story of enclosure. Indeed, one of the hallmarks of Williams-Forson's work overall, including Eating While Black, is her careful attention to the futility of theorizing food cultures in totalizing ways or creating binaries that pit one way of seeing and being against another. To continue with this spatial theme, the same spaces of enclosure that we point to as examples of anti-Black racism are also some of the same spaces that produce Black ingenuity, improvisation, and creativity. Number 3, the Black radical imagination and food. The conditions that produce Black suffering, dispossession, and death are important. They're the context in which we're all fighting and the forces that we're fighting against. Anti-Blackness is, to quote Christina Sharp, the weather, and within the weather is disaster, but there is also possibility. While we're constituted through and by continued vulnerability to the overwhelming force of the weather of anti-Blackness, we're not only known to ourselves or to each other by that force. What Professor Williams-Forson reminds us of in her work is that food is one way that we know ourselves and each other beyond violence. And in that way, the social, communal, and personal experiences of joy, delight, and pleasure are not to go unnoticed. To neglect joy, delight, and pleasure reduces Black people's food needs to only being biological, stripping away the human emotions, feelings, and experiences that exceed biology. In Freedom Dreams, Robin D.G. Kelley writes that without new visions, we don't know what to build, only what to knock down. And he continues on to say that a map to the new world is in the imagination. In his work on the Black radical tradition more broadly, Kelley points to Black social movements as case studies in the development of freedom dreams over time, pushing back against binary framings of success and failure as the only measures of those dreams and movements. Through organizing, art, poetry, music, and deep study, Black people have dreamt of new lands, new ways of relating socially and economically, and new freedoms. Food has played a central part in this. At the heart of Professor Williams-Forson's argument about food shaming is actually the opposite of shaming itself. It's the enduring question. What does it mean to practice freedom through food and culinary traditions? And I think in particular, for those of us who are interested in scholarly and activist trajectories, what changes, if any, if we put food at the center of the Black radical imagination? How or can we embrace a definition of freedom in our food worlds that expands our conceptualization of what it means to fight for access, equity, and justice? And perhaps for discussion today, how can we sit with this tension that Professor Williams-Forson points out between making do in the meantime, while also not getting complacent as we build the worlds we want to see? In preparation for today, I was reminded of something I posted about 5 years ago on Facebook, to which Professor Williams-Forson responded. And in the spirit of the vulnerability and sharing that comes through in the storytelling that is a part of Eating While Black, I'll share it today. After a very long day, where I'm certain I did entirely too much with far too few resources and still had to go home and take care of myself, I posted, "Sometimes self-care looks like Popeye's drive-thru." This post is for women who considered indigestion when stir-fried veggies weren't enough. And in the world that Psyche Williams-Forson is writing us toward, there is no shame in that. Instead, there is recognition, there's validation, and affirmation that we're all doing the best we can. And before any of us fix our mouths to say something about what other folks are doing to take care of themselves, may we hear the voice of the food gods say, "Worry about yourself." Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Reese, for those wonderful comments. Chef Kabui?
Thank you so very much, Dr. Reese, for going before me and setting such a high standard. Those are lovely remarks, spot on. Thank you very much for Dr. Syke William Fawson for doing such a fabulous job that brings us together. And as a result, now I'm connected to more people than I have. And let me also just give a shout out for the long relationship that we've had. I've admired her work as one of the elders in this work, a senior, and I salute and I'm honored to be with you. Now, mine as an anthropologist and a chef, you know, I'm more comfortable talking about food and cooking. I wish I was talking to you when I was cooking, but I'm not doing that. So I'll do my very, very level best because, so as I said, it's easier for me to talk to people who have some food in my mouth because I can get away with a lot of stuff. You know, when you're cooking to people, you get away with a lot of stuff. So mine is going to be a short form of storytelling as a response to the wonderful book that Dr. Syke has produced. And mine, I have a very, very different perspective because I was born Kenyan. I was born by my parents, who are deeply involved in the struggle for liberation. And my father was a prisoner of war for 6.5 years in the British Gulag. When my father was in the Gulag, the first time he was captured, he spent some time as a prisoner. He realized very quickly that the British, and now, by the way, for the sake of context, we're talking about 1950. So that was 5 years after the end of the Second World War, or this, what I call the Second White War, and the British were running out of resources. They had been broke as a result of the war with Hitler. So what happened is the British were facing one of the most severest resistance from Africans who had been captured and conscripted in a war that didn't benefit in any way. So when I read the book, this book took my mind right back to that conflict between the British and my family and my country, people of my country, whereby Africans who are being recruited to go and fight for democracy, they didn't enjoy. And they didn't enjoy in their own home. And while they had been dispossessed of their land. So anyway, my father very quickly realized that the British didn't have enough food and they were using food politically. They were using food to punish Africans for contracted infractions. So they say, oh, you guys are making too much noise, so you won't have food tomorrow. And that was just their own way of stretching the food resources that they had. And I brought this story as a sign of a long story to remind us a long history that Black people have had across cultures where they've always been receiving the butt, they've been at the butt of the jokes, they've been at the barrel of political alignment, and both their bodies have been used to ensure the success of other communities. In this particular case, we're talking about white supremacy as the people who are in power. So very quickly, my father organized the people who are in the confinement with him, and they threatened the British authorities with a mass protest. And as a result, the newspaper people came. They asked who was organizing this protest. And as a result, they took a picture of my father. So I'm in possession of my father, wearing prisoners' gear as a result of something that had to do with food. And that's exactly what this book reminded me. Now, because of that, my father became extremely sensitive to the way that he would consume food, to the point where if you gave my father any food he had to hold with his hand, he would say he doesn't want it. He would rather starve other than accept food handed with him by somebody with his food. So you always had to serve my father on a nice plate and with a fork or a spoon. He would not eat food like that. Why? Because he suffered from this psychological torture where he understood food to be extremely political in a way that we just generally don't. As a result of that, I was very, very fortunate because I was raised by some of the best food that I know. My father, I was born 5 years after independence. We had a beautiful farm. So 10 years of my life, I grew up in a village where we produced 95% of the food we ate. Fast forward, my father and my mother were both activists, very active in the movement. So when I came to the US, it was the very first time I had eaten food that is both canned or frozen. I had always eaten fresh food. When I was in high school, my father paid probably the most expensive lunch for me at a nearby fine dining restaurant for me to have lunch, which is probably, when we did the math, was about the equivalent of $45. I'm saying that to say that my parents were proactive in ensuring that I will not be shamed because of food. So when I came to the US and I was on campus, being on campus for the first time is the first time I ate what I call fiat food, or processed food, or decentralized food, or what I call empiristic food. This food was so horrible that I had to drop out of college and figure out my eating before I could go back to college. And luckily, I was able to go to my HBCU. That is the background of my experience in the US. And that's how I formulated my cuisine, which I call Afrofuturistic conscious cuisine, as a way of fighting this, which is what the book extremely talked about. I'm saying that now to create context for my few remarks, which is actually the story that I just want to share. That if we as Black people, okay, let me say one more thing, that my culture that produced that kind of consciousness in my father has an inbuilt means of protecting against the abuse of food in the way we exist in this world. Food is so central to us and is built into our pride, and all our lives are built around ensuring food security. Because in the world in which we live, politics is what other people think about us, how we think about ourselves, and how we think about the future. If we take those three things, we realize that we cannot have any negotiations when it comes to food, that we should always eat the best food possible if we are going to be in line with those ways. So I thought that that was something that was unique until I came to the US again, and I learned that even this struggle, these things that we're talking about, has been going on since Africans started coming to the shores of this country. And as we might find in one book by Eduardo Aquino, The Life of Eduardo Aquino, of Gustavus Vassa, when I read the book, I was taken aback when Eduardo Aquino was first brought here and sold into the first plantation. And the very first day of his work on the plantation, he was taken, he was given the job of finding the master of the farm, who was sick. And as he was being taken to his bedroom, he saw an African-American woman with a mouthpiece cooking in the kitchen. So this woman was cooking, but she could not eat the food that she was cooking for the family. Again, the roots of our shaming just goes beyond the bodies and what we do, but first and foremost, in our existing in this country, that we existed in this country in ways that we were not very, very unappreciated, and in ways that ashamed us in our very, very, very core being. So after that, the other, as Dr. Reese said, I was looking at three things. I looked at the response or an experience of Eduardo Aquino, and then of the two Black chefs who are probably most prominent in this country before the Civil Rights Movement, which was the chef for Dr. President George Washington, as well as Thomas Jefferson. Those two Black chefs did so much, especially the chef for Thomas Jefferson, James Hemings, who created the Southern cuisine, but who ended up committing suicide because of partly drinking and the stress of being in this country. So finally, if we think about the modern day research that was done in Netherlands, whereby we have this concept of Dutch winter hunger, whereby the research showed that people who were deprived of food in Netherlands during the German occupation ended up being obese 50 years down the road because of being born in the mind of scarcity. So I say, if white people, so-called who believe in white supremacy, can suffer only after 3 or 4, 5 years of occupation by the Germans, and the German occupation, which was led to the Dutch winter hunger, only lasted 5 months, can suffer physiological bodily changes because of such experience. What do other people think Black people who have been suffering from white supremacy go through after 300 years of contact with whites who think are superior than them? So my point is, if people are going to shame other people's in the past, if people are going to write articles using young Black girls and using their bodies and shaming them and actually trying to insinuate that all these children need is to have the willpower, that should be a shame on them. That should be a shame on them in the highest order. But on the other side, as James Baldwin would say, that people are more likely to cry than they are to think. So we are equally challenged to take on the mantle of ensuring that we eat the best food we possibly can at all costs. So thank you so very much. I hope this book starts a very, very healthy dialogue moving forward and is a jewel in the addition of the work that Dr. Fawson has so well done and set up an example for us. Thank you so very much.
Thank you so much, Chef. Thank you for those wonderful comments, the personal story, and also for making those diasporic connections. Our next presenter is Dr. Jennifer Wallach.
Well, thank you. It's an honor to get to share some of my thoughts about this book, which I've really been enjoying engaging with this week, and especially in such a distinguished group. As I was reading the book, not the manuscript, the book, I was thinking back to several years ago when I had the privilege of being part of a workshop where we talked about the first draft of the manuscript. And it was just really thrilling for me to see how it ended up, how these brilliant raw ideas, how they'd been refined and shaped into this wonderful manuscript. And as I was thinking about that experience, I was thinking about what it was about the book and what it was about Psyche Williams-Forson herself as a scholar that is so magical and so compelling. And one of the things I was thinking about was that facet of her where she set up a workshop to ask for feedback. And she's equally generous with giving feedback to other people, which I find remarkable and kind of distinctive. I mean, particularly for somebody, honestly, of her stature, right? She's one of the biggest scholars in food studies. She is somebody who has really created, in a lot of ways, a new thriving subfield. And she's somebody who could kind of rest on her laurels, and she doesn't. Instead, she's still actively engaged in conversation and very, very generous about sharing space, which is something that if you read the book, you'll see with her citation practices. She's really generous with citing, bringing in other scholars, making them co-equals in the conversation. And so because of this perspective, I think this book is really unique because it does a couple different things. It gives us the extended analysis of one scholar, and it also provides a really richly detailed documentation of a shared and interconnected experience, with food serving as a source of shame, anxiety, or uncomfortable introspection in an African American context. So I fully anticipate that scholars of the future will read, analyze, benefit from this book for all of its intellectual insights. But the historian in me was also thinking of this book as really a powerful primary source of sorts for future people to think about this particular moment. I kept thinking to myself, if only somebody that was as keen an observer as Dr. Williams-Forson had written a book like this for the historical moments I was studying. So she's also provided us with this really valuable record of conversations, interactions, snippets that if she hadn't documented them would be lost. And not only does she document them, but she shows us how these conversations, how these interactions around food are layered with meaning and convey something really vital about the lived essence of particular people. But I would do Psyche's work an injustice if I just acknowledged the richness of the way she deals with current conversations, current dynamics, her own sort of lecture tour after her first book where she had these conversations, without also acknowledging the way that her work painstakingly traces the roots of present day shame back to histories of enslavement, back to the aftermath of that. And in fact, Eating While Black is a masterwork in interdisciplinarity. If you haven't had a chance to read it yet, it's mind-blowing to see her facility not only with the discipline of history, but also with sociology, geography, anthropology, philosophy, literary criticism, among many other lenses. So as I was reading this text, I found myself reflecting on a couple different things, reflecting on some specific and really meaningful intellectual contributions that I think this book makes to Black food studies, to Africana studies in general. But I was also thinking about the method, the way that she tells these stories. And going back to kind of my first comment about how the generosity of her wanting to exchange and share and get and give feedback. So I think that something about her method is really important. And I wanted to think about that too. So what I want to do for the rest of the time I have is to just sort of briefly highlight a few memorable elements of both her message in the book, but also to think just a tiny bit about her methods, about the way she tells a compelling story, because I think that that's one of the things that's going to make this book lasting and enduring and relevant to so many conversations. So let me start quickly with the message. I mean, obviously, the central contribution of this book is that she gives an incredibly detailed definition and also exploration of the phenomenon of food shaming. But what I think is really special and important about the book is it's very particular, but it's also broadly applicable. She writes in the beginning of Eating While Black that this book is written for lots of audiences. She speaks to lots of audiences simultaneously in ways that I think are really brilliant, something I'm going to talk about later. But it's specifically, she says, geared towards African-American communities. And I think that emphasis is obvious. Her core audience is always in mind, you can tell. But she also is so careful about bringing in broader frameworks, comparative examples, and demonstrating the ways that food stories can simultaneously be engaged with both as very, very distinctive and particular, but also as interconnected and overlapping. So she again and again gives us a small frame and a big frame and gives us tools to think about lots and lots of stories, not just her core story. She also, of course, made contributions to this ever-expanding, wonderful literature in African-American food studies. And this literature in general has done a lot to sort of debunk the ideas of a monolithic and totalizing Black way of eating. But I don't know that anybody has debunked myths as succinctly and as well as Psyche when she talks about what she calls the farcical and absurd stories that reduce African-American food culture to scraps, purportedly scraps provided by slaveholders she's referring to. And so she debunks this myth of a foodway based on scraps by documenting the ingenuity of enslaved people who used a lot of methods to increase and enhance their diets. But she does it in a really complicated way without minimizing the forces that constrained them. And she applies a really profound concept of what Avery Gordon calls complex personhood to historical subjects who created these food traditions, that they were complex, that they were, part of them was tragedy, part of them was the beauty of creating this cuisine, and back again. So the complexity she captures is very, very profound. Her comfort with working with historical records helps her tell that story, but also she has a lot of comfort analyzing films and literature, acting as an ethnographer of the self and of other people. And she created a really rare book that makes sure the past and present are always in dialogue with each other. And as a historian, this is something that I'm really sensitive about, because I think sometimes we get uncomfortable stepping out of the past. It's kind of comfortable to have subjects that don't talk back to you. But sometimes people that write about contemporary food issues aren't very historically minded. They don't know about the steps that sort of led us to this moment. And what this book does is it has us do both things. She insists that readers think about now and then. And she tells us very clearly, slavery permeates every aspect of Black lives. So there has to be this dialogue. And I think that this is something that's missing in some conversations that she brings very forcefully. We have to have both. Finally, in terms of contribution, I just want to mention really briefly that I loved the concept that she labeled Black food energy. She put into words something that I know people have sensed or experienced, but she took the time to try to describe, to define, to explain what that was, something that was really necessary for her to establish which spaces were more sort of prone to being spaces where shaming could occur. But I also think that in creating this concept of food energy, she's given us a concept that has a lot of utility, something that I think that we can use to explore a variety of dynamics at various sites of consumption. So I think that that concept of Black food energy is something that is going to be taken from this book and become part of many conversations, because it's just a really valuable concept. I also want to talk, finally, to conclude, a little bit about method. I think that in scholarly works like this, we don't always think about how the method of the delivery, we don't really think about style. But in this book, so many things just jumped out at me as being incredibly effective and worth emulating and worth thinking about. So I want to end my comments by saying just a couple of things about the style of this work that I think are part of the message and make the message really impactful. So a couple of stylistic decisions that I want to mention. She does something really powerful where she juxtaposes an autobiographical voice. We learn about her family, her friends, her education, her story, with her scholarly arguments. And she does this in a way that forcefully destroys any fiction of objectivity that's still lingering out there. And it's still lingering out there. But this idea that there's sort of omnipotence, she shows us that she's coming to this story, to this history, to these encounters from a particular place. And she invites her audience very effectively to see these moments through her eyes from her subject position. She also uses language while doing this that's really very artful. At moments, I felt like I was reading a compelling literary autobiography, or maybe even, not to say it's fictionalized, but a novel, something really powerful. She lures you in. For example, when talking about the buffalo of her childhood, she talks about it being cold and dreary as far as the eye could see or the skin could feel. So these descriptions really, I think, bring readers to imaginatively follow her intellectual journey. She even uses punctuation creatively. There are exclamation marks punctuated throughout this book, moments of emphasis. You're not used to seeing that in a scholarly book, and it just hits you. So these are tools that I think I'm going to take away and I'm going to think about. And there are lots of twists and turns. So I want to end one last comment by talking about one twist and turn she takes us on in this book that I think shows sort of the value, the power of her perspective. Early in the text, one of these autobiographical stories is about an experience she had where she went to the home of a white academic administrator for a meal. And she and some other people of color had been on a committee with this woman talking about diversity issues, and they had felt marginalized and disregarded and kind of like tokenized, that they were there not for their input, but for their identities. So this invitation to come to this woman's home was really fraught, but it was one for various reasons that many people didn't think they could turn down because of the power dynamics in academia. So they got to this person's house and they were served what she describes as unseasoned tofu kebabs. And this was at a moment, she tells us, when tofu wasn't quite the common food that it is now. It was something many people had probably never had. And I mean, if you're familiar with tofu, unseasoned tofu is particularly unsavory. And so she talks about how uncomfortable that was, what that dynamic was like. And she ends up making the unseasoned plates of tofu metaphors. The tofu is not getting eaten, people aren't enjoying it, and it's sitting there on a plate as a really powerful metaphor, a metaphor of the power dynamics taking place, a metaphor of a meal that people didn't want to eat, but they also couldn't completely refuse. So this is really compelling analysis, but it's also kind of ambiguous. I was thinking it'd be really interesting to talk about this with students because there are other interpretations that you could perhaps conjure up with this dynamic. And I was so compelled and so delighted 100 pages later to see Psyche herself delivering an alternate way to think about this moment, where she wonders out loud if the tofu serving host herself had felt shamed by not having her meal consumed. So to me, in a nutshell, this is what's so important about this book, about this perspective, about Psyche William-Forson's voice as a scholar. She turns that story inside out. She gives us multiple vantage points and interpretations. She embraces multiplicity, nuance, contradiction, and she doesn't ever let her readers off the hook from grappling with various dimensions of these stories, stories that can't be reduced to a simple myth of scrap eating, stories that can't be confined to the bounds of any singular academic discipline or can't be summed up in any single one-dimensional story. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Wallach. Our last presenter, panelist is Dr. Adrienne Miller.
Good evening. You know what? Everybody was so good. We can just go straight to questions. No, I'm just kidding.
We need to hear from you.
No, I got this up there.
We want to hear from you.
Yes. Good evening, everyone. I just want to say this is such a wonderful book. I wish it was around when I was writing my soul food book 10 years ago, because it really spoke to my writing life. So I'm going to limit my comments just for the sake of time to just kind of how this book really touches my writing life now that I've decided to write about African heritage cuisines and kind of my experiences. And what I love about this book is I think of it as a culinary declaration of independence. I see it as Dr. Psyche saying, hey, look, this is what's happening when we talk about Black food in obvious ways and ways that aren't so obvious. And these are the implications and consequences of that. And I loved it. So, one thing that I really loved was just how consistently she uses these anecdotes to show her points. And I'm going to talk about this a little bit later, but the young lady who was losing weight because she wanted to improve her health, but also because she was bullied. I think about her daughter, Dr. Psyche's daughter, the way that she shared some of her experiences. Some of them were very heartbreaking. There's some whimsical moments. I think about the student in her class who was the exercise where they had to buy food on a limited budget and he just resorted to pizza and weed. I thought that was hilarious. I laughed out loud about that one. But there's a lot of poignant moments here. So let me talk about kind of my experiences and how it ties in with this book. I remember when I first decided to write a book on the history of soul food, I got a lot of resistance from what I'll call gatekeepers but most of them were predominantly white. I expected that. I got things like, hey, look, this is interesting, but nobody's going to want a serious treatment of soul food. Or, hey, there's already a book on soul food in the market. There's really no room. There's no need for another one, even though that book in the market was a cookbook written 20 years earlier. And, I was sitting there thinking about like how many books about French food, Italian food, Chinese food come out year after year after year, but there's only room for one of our books in the market. But what really thrills me about this book is how Dr. Psyche takes on kind of Black critiques of talking about things like soul food. And I'm glad she points out that soul food has become shorthand for all African-American cooking, and that's not accurate. But how essentially this has become a problem that we see within our own community and a lot of food shaming. So I really appreciate her comments there. So in my own writing journey, I remember when I first was thinking, writing a book on soul food was just a notion. I was talking to a young cousin of mine who's probably 15 years old. And I was telling him about, I'm writing a book, and he immediately perked up and thought it was interesting. And then when I told him I'm writing a book on the history of soul food, he was like, well, I don't know if I want to hear about somebody being in somebody's kitchen. I also heard, hey, you went to Stanford University. You're going to use your talents to write about soul food. And that was one I never expected. That was curious to me. Also that, hey, our people struggled and overcame, so we don't have to eat this food, which led into the pervasive critique. You're literally digesting white supremacy by celebrating soul food. And so I kept hearing these things over and over. And then finally, and Dr. Psyche brings this up numerous times in her book, that soul food is killing us. And I think that's connected to the soul food or African-American cuisine as scraps, which dominates the narrative about our food traditions. And, that's part of the story, but it's certainly not the entire story. And it just pains me year after year, usually around Black History Month, you get a number of articles talking about the health implications of soul food. And there's very little critical analysis or even a comprehensive view of making that point. And you not only see it in majority press, but you see it in a lot of Black-centered media as well. So my hope, of one of many hopes, is that this book will start a conversation and will call on people to take a more comprehensive look at our food traditions. And if they're going to talk about nutrition or these other things, as Dr. Psyche rightly points out, you have to look at systemic racism, you have to look at structures. There's so much more you have to look at instead of just narrowing solely on the food and letting that be the beginning and end of the discussion. I think this work spurred a lot of self-reflection on my part, and also thinking about larger questions. So I know that several times while reading this book, when she made a point, I was like, oh man, that's what I've been thinking. And I wondered to myself, well, why am I so readily accepting this thought about African-American food? Why do I place primacy or privilege on, veganism or other expressions of food as healthy eating, right? And in my presentation, just know that I push back on this idea that soul food is inherently unhealthy for a lot of reasons that were brought up in this book. And I tell people, look, think about what nutritionists are telling us to eat: more dark leafy greens, more sweet potatoes, okra as a superfood, hibiscus. A lot of these things are the building blocks of our cuisine. And as this book points out, it's about context and perspective, and not about eating these things in excess. Another thing that I thought about is when the discussion about food deserts, and how I have been lazy in my thinking about food deserts and not taking a deeper dive to see what food is available in these areas. Instead of just uncritically accepting the narrative, thinking about what food is really available in these areas. And I think Dr. Psyche really does a great job of just connecting the dots to show how people access food in different ways at different times. So it's another interesting twist on, we're not monolithic in our experience. And, for a lot of people, that's a duh moment, but sadly to say. I wasn't critical in my thinking a lot of times when I think about food deserts. And so one thing that this work has had me think about is, almost every aspect of our culture has gone global. The way we talk, walk, dress, worship, entertain, move, play sports, you name it, except our food. And so the question is, well, why has that happened? And even when our food does go global or gets more exposure, a lot of times it's disconnected to Black culture, unless there's some obvious racist connotation that's associated with it. I have some thoughts about that, but I think this book entertains those questions to have us think about it. And then just let me give you a few data points. One is, I just don't, because of the food shaming and other things, we don't have a lot of cheerleaders or boosters for our food traditions. I think of some of our very recognizable people in our community started talking about our food with more of an intentionality of love and celebration. I think that would change the dynamic. And y'all can correct me in the chat or later in the discussion here, but I think about the groundbreaking 1619 project, which was a nice survey of Black culture, but I just don't remember anything about food. And I know you can't do everything, but I think food, and I guess I am biased, but I think food should be on the short list of things we talk about, because we have fundamentally contributed to the food traditions of this country. So I think we need more cheerleaders for our cuisine to make that point. And this book goes a long way into getting people to think critically about how we talk about our food and how we project it to other people. And I really think books like this will change the dynamic. So my hope in just closing is, again, that we will heed the call for this culinary Declaration of Independence, that we will be thoughtful about how we talk about our food, how we think about our food, and engage in these interesting conversations and game-changing conversations. So thank you so much for writing this book. And it just brought up a lot of memories of my own food journey. And let me close with this. A lot of times when I present on my soul food book, just to get the crowd going, I do a call and response through various soul food dishes. And I tell people, you can clap, snap your fingers, say amen, whatever to affirm the dish. And usually when I go through this representative soul food meal, when I get to chitlins, that's when the room just starts to lose it. And almost always in the question and answer period, then I get questions about, chitlins, offal, the scraps, all of that kind of stuff. And so I use it as a teaching point to talk about, hey, that's part of the story. And this is why this comes from. This comes from just this one thing that happened, the hog killing tradition in the American South. Yes, that was a moment in the agricultural calendar, but hey, there's a lot more going on when it comes to the food story in terms of fishing, foraging, hunting, all these other things. Enslaved people were raising their own crops, gardening, raising their own livestock, all of these things. So it's a much more complex picture. So thank you for writing this book. And I just think it's just a wonderful work. And thank you for this foundation that will, I hope, bring a springboard to more conversation.
Thank you, Dr. Miller. We'll now have Dr. Psyche Williams for some comment on some of the panelists' comments.
I'd be delighted, but I can't, my video has been stopped. Okay, all right, great,
Oh,
excellent. Thank you. And thank all of you for these incredible insights. I mean, I couldn't take enough notes on all of you all's perspectives. Dr. Reese, you already know our conversations can continue on, and I always, you say I'm the mentor, but I think we mentor one another, and I appreciate you completely. Dr. Wallach, same for you. As you know, I engaged some of your work in several places throughout the book, both yours and Dr. Reese's, because it's so instrumental to my thinking. Chef Kabui, I am always in awe of your stories and the ease with which you share various aspects of your life. And we have to talk some more about the Afrofuturistic consciousness around food. I look forward to that moment. And then, of course, Adrian Miller, you are, one of the inspirations for my not riding the top of the bus at the Southern Foodway Symposium, but that's another story. But that experience has led me to write about Black folks and food and travel, right? And so once again, as with you, I learned so much always from your rich contributions and your ways of thinking about this thing that we call Black food studies. So thank you all so much. Also to the conveners of this panel, I appreciate your even inviting me to showcase my work. I do think that this is important work. It was, as I said in the book, designed to open up questions, right? I was having a conversation with my daughter, who I actually bounced quite a few things off, and we were talking about the Nigerian novelist's work, the Nigerian novelist Chimamanda Adichie, and her very, very, very important TED Talk for anyone who's unfamiliar, The Danger of the Single Story, right? I discovered that that TED Talk's about 15 minutes. I discovered it about over a decade ago, and I use it to start all of my classes, and it was very much a part of the underpinning of this book, because what she says in short is that no story is the only story, right? But yet we go through life crafting single stories about other people all the time. We do it deliberately and we do it unintentionally. One of the best stories she tells is about being a woman of means, growing up in Nigeria, and her family having a young helper come live with them. And the fact that she was told over and over and over again that this young man's family was poor. So eat your food because, Philae, his family has no food. We're going to give them clothes because they have nothing, right? But then they go to his village one day, and while they're visiting, Philae's mother shows their family a piece of artwork that Philae's brother had done, and it was a brilliant piece of art. And she said, it never occurred to me that such beauty could come from this family, because the only story we had ever heard is that they were poor. Right? That's the only story she had ever heard. So in the same way I say about eating while Black, I basically say, if you only have ever heard the story that starts with Black people in positions of victimhood, or as Black people in positions in need of correction, or we are always seen as incapable, or everything about Blackness is bad, then that's your single story about Black culture and Black heritage. So food, our clothing, our dance, all of it is going to be perceived as negative, right? It's never going to be a thing of beauty, because that's not the story that we have been told. I also like the fact that she says every single story may have some element of truth, every stereotype, but the problem with the stereotype is it's just not complete, right? There are always other parts to the story, and what I tried to do with Eating While Black is to open up the various stories that can be told. So thank you all very much. I appreciate your engagement with this work, and I'm looking at the time and am happy to have the panel answer some questions, or I'm happy to answer some questions. I saw one in the chat about Black folks needing to do better about our eating and so forth, because we're dying of high blood pressure and diabetes. I just want to say, and I say this all the time, you're absolutely right. We are, and we are not the only ones who are dying in this way. See, that's part of the single story. If we follow the media, it would be believed that Black people have the worst diets. When in reality, the higher your income is, the less likely you are to eat at home, according to a study that was done a couple of years back at University of California, Davis. Because you have disposable income, you spend it in different places. It just doesn't get tallied the same way because, see, it would become fine dining versus, McDonald's. And when it's fine dining, that's different. When you eat out at fine dining, you drink expensive wine and liquors, that's perceived to be different than eating foods that are fast, even though eating out tends to be just eating out, right? So how we look at these things become very, very important there. And I just want to say this before we close up, and that is, I agree, we all need to probably take another look at our food and how much we eat, how much we expend, all of that. But let's not get too focused on our food that we forget that we live in a society that keeps us stressed, oppressed, repressed, depressed, right? Stroke and heart attacks happen every day, even when of those who have the best diets. We know state and police violence also knows no name and it's not going to ask you if you ate your vegetables that day, right? So we want to be careful of the red herring and of how things like food keep us so focused on punishing each other, while those who are intent upon keeping our lives shortened by lack of access to resources, by consummate inequality and inequity, while they're doing that, we're focused on the food. What I would like to suggest is that we be Janus face and we constantly are pivoting and being aware of all these dynamics, because when we don't, we close ourselves off to the enemy that's behind, which tends not to be food, but is far more insidious.
Thank you for that. I think we have a couple of questions in the Q&A and a couple of questions in the chat.
Yes, so if we can have our panelists come back on screen so we can have a panel view so anyone can answer our questions. So the first question, Dr. Psyche kind of already answered. So we're gonna go ahead and ask our second question, which is a little lengthy, but bear with me. It says, hello, my name is Armani Stewart, and I am a second year grad student of Africana Studies program at Georgia State University. My thesis research focuses on the intersection of displacement, cultural memory, and health and food practices of African American women. My question I want to present to the panel is, how do we refine narratives around Black food cultures or Black culinary epistemologies as a part of as part and parcel of prominent food movements like the slow food movement, without reinforcing food shaming, particularly around Black women's food practices? It's a little long. If I can repeat it if you need me to.
Dr. Williams?
Right, I was going to say, I'm happy to answer it, but also I open it up to the panel if someone else wants to take it on as well. Okay. Oh, go ahead, Dr. Reese.
I mean, I have a couple of thoughts here, and I don't want to. Well, first of all, I think one of the places we might step back and think is, what is the value of reifying narratives around Black food cultures in spaces like slow food? And I'm not suggesting that there isn't, but I guess I'm trying to pull apart why there, right? I think the places where we start to tell the stories matters, and I think how movements come together matters. So that's one thing. But I think there's a really probably almost simple answer here for me, which is like, there's a difference between being a part of a movement and, making political and personal choices around food for yourself or within community or with your family, versus then trying to make those same choices for other people. And I think this was what comes up in the book, right? That like, it's hard to take values writ large and it not almost inherently like produce a certain kind of shaming effect if you're trying to take those values outside of yourself and the
Just
spaces
like
within your immediate control and inflict them on someone else. And so I guess my short answer to that question is there's a need to resist this idea that these larger movements that are aspirational, absolutely, but that the larger movements that are aspirational is not a unidirectional relationship. It's not that we take those things that are part of those movements and they filter down to us. We are constantly like pushing back against creating and shaping those things together. So I think sometimes what is inherent in these questions around food is how something that is top up is having an impact on us at the bottom, but like that relationship is going both ways.
I agree 100%. I couldn't have said it better. Absolutely. There are also a couple of questions in the Q&A, I think.
One question.
Yeah.
Okay,
Sorry,
I'm sorry, Christina.
a
Go
little
ahead.
delayed, just a little delayed. We have a question that was already answered by one of our panelists, but I wanted to ask it, ask it again. And the question states, to any of our panelists, in your work, have you encountered narratives where it appears that food was used as a tool to keep Black people out of certain spaces?
Oh, yeah. Oh, yes. I think all of us have. I mean, Chef Kabui talked a little bit about this, certainly. You know, Dr. Miller did, and all of us write about the ways in which, you know, throughout various movements, right? Food has been used as a way of keeping Black folks out. Dr. Wallach, you have a number of those in your work that you could probably mention. A number of those instances, especially with social movements, the ways in which food has been used to keep people out.
Hey, Psyche, I have a quick question. Do you think your Ruth Chris anecdote from The Wire is an example, the one in the book?
Yeah, that is a good one. If you have seen that, thank you for reminding me of that. If you've seen the series The Wire, in the Eating While Black, I focus on I think it was the 3rd or 4th season where the children were the focus. And there's a scene in there where ex-police chief Bunny takes a group of students to Ruth Chris because they had successfully completed this assignment. But anyone who's ever been to Ruth Chris or any other upscale, you know, fine dining restaurant knows that there's a whole culture that goes along with that, right? From speaking in hushed tones to listening to music to understanding what the maitre d or what the server is explaining to you is on the menu, or the difference between the host or the maitre d and your actual the person who's actually taking your order. There's a whole culture. And so he takes these children there and they immediately feel a number of different assaults, if you will, right? And by the end of the night, they are like, take us to McDonald's, you know. So he sort of overshot, you know, the reward there by taking them someplace that was in Baltimore, right in their hometown, but still inaccessible to them because of the cultural dynamics. It would be inaccessible to a lot of young people who don't have that experience of fine dining, a lot of old people who don't have that, older people who don't have that experience. So food spaces in and of itself, to go back to what Dr. Reese was saying about space and place being central in this text, because the very space of a place can really, Black Food Energy can really say you're welcome or you're not welcome, right? Thank you for that reminder.
I have to, can I add something, just one small point about that point that Andrew Miller raised? It's okay?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Yeah. I laughed when I read that section in the book about one specific thing. Number one, I don't get a chance to watch a lot of shows. So I wasn't familiar with the show. And as somebody who didn't grow up in the US and somebody who is a chef themselves, it was almost actually a poster book example of how cultural differences about food can make people uncomfortable in certain areas, especially when you're stepping in them from a point of disadvantage, okay? And that came about when I read about the boys' reaction of trying to drink water with a straw. And their host told them, man, you don't drink water with a straw, or food that is special for today doesn't mean that it's cheap or anything like that, or is on sale or things like that. So that's something I wasn't aware of. I know I work in food, but I've never really paid attention, to whether people drink water or not. But for me, it might not necessarily make me feel out of place. And I think that's my biggest emphasis here, is that food shaming only really takes root or comes about when you have power imbalance, because there's no way everybody knows anything. I travel with white people all the time to Kenya for a tour and stuff like that. Right now, I'm talking to you from Iceland, by the way. I'm in Reykjavik. And, I'm talking to these people about their own history that not all the people that I'm talking to know about their sagas and stuff, because I've had the opportunity to learn it. Does that mean make me better than them? No. But there is that element that when there is mutual respect, when you don't know something, you simply ask. But when you're already stepping into a place with fear, you're already predisposition to be ashamed, because there'll be so many instances that you feel as though, and a lot of times, even we don't want, as Black people, we don't want to ask certain questions. Why? Because we are not very comfortable, because of the power imbalance. So that's all I wanted to ask. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we have one more question in the Q&A, Christina.
Yeah, I'm gonna take this one. This is
Okay.
Nick. Says, from Andrea Payne, can anyone also speak to the gentrification of Black cuisine, i.e. white people never celebrated Kwanzaa, creating these dreadful Kwanzaa cakes, or certain restaurants Americanizing Afro-Caribbean cuisine to make it more appealing to a broader audience, and in essence relinquishing some of their cultural norms?
Well, this is Adrian Miller. I can speak to that in the world of barbecue very briefly. So my third book was on African-American barbecue culture. And what I note is that since the 1990s, there's been a sharp turn in barbecue towards white dudes. And it's pretty much four kinds of white dudes. You got the competition guy, you've got the Bubba, working class white dude, you've got the hipster, and you've got the fine dining chef. And what they've done is they have the media attention and spotlight that they have gotten has shifted barbecue from what was a Black aesthetic for 2 centuries to a white aesthetic. So it's the idea that you have perfectly Instagrammable beef brisket slices, right? That you can't have sauce, that, all of these things that we associate. And then there's only a certain way to cook barbecue. That's been happening in barbecue circles, and it's had real life impact on African Americans who are restaurateurs and others who are in the barbecue space, because people are coming into their restaurant having heard from white media what barbecue is, and they look at what these Black folks are offering, and people are saying, well, that's not what I saw before, that's not real barbecue. So I am really trying to spread the word that, here's a perfect example, burnt ends. Okay, so burnt ends were created by an African-American restaurateur in Kansas City, Arthur Bryant, and it was the crispy, fatty end of a brisket that was kind of shaved off, and he put it on a bowl on a counter, and people and customers would nibble on it while they were waiting for their orders to be filled. Now you've got people paying what, $30 a pound for burnt ends. It's been completely commodified, and they're not even actually getting the original burnt ends. What's now happening is people are cutting off actual brisket, putting a char on it and calling that burnt ends. And so to me, that's one of the more dramatic examples in barbecue. I don't know if it's completely on point, but it's just something I've been seeing.
I think maybe perhaps also another example to go along with that, Adrian, and also just think about commodification and the market and kind of keeping capitalism at the front of this too is, I guess, what was it, around 2012 or 2013 when Whole Foods had the College of the New Kale tagline, and then it spurred that a lot of conversation on Twitter and otherwise around food gentrification as a process, right? And in that moment, and I think this really what drives home one of the points you make in the book, Psyche, that something can be a form of power without it being like direct violence or overt. And for a massive corporation like Whole Foods that has arguably been one of the leaders in trying to define what is healthy and what is not healthy in terms of what people eat, for them to make this declaration absent of any kind of like historical or other references to the ways Black folks engage collard greens, or even the ways that Black folks are villainized around collard greens, was such a huge moment, I think, for people to really stop and think about. And I think, this goes back to the question earlier around food and obesity and all these things. That kind of reinforces this very individualized understanding of health and healthiness, and individualism has never served Black people. And so there's a way that when we put the focus back on how corporations engage the market, we remember that it is not only that consumers are engaging a market, and we're not the only ones who have power. Corporations have power to shape the market and taste and preference and those kinds of things. And I think that can have an impact directly to this question around what is in vogue and what isn't at any given moment. And I think, Adrian, your book, when you talk about the rise of soul food restaurants and then the dramatic, decline, I don't think that's disconnected from who is shaping the market.
Mm-hmm.
Wow, this has been a great discussion tonight. I'm so pleased that you all joined us for another one of our webinar series hosted by Howard University Social Justice Consortium in cooperation with and on behalf of the Mellon Just Futures Initiative. LaShawn, thank you so much for pulling everyone together. Psyche, your book was fabulous. Panelists, we couldn't have done it without you. Wonderful remarks, wonderful. Next week, we'll be talking about the book, The Bonds of Inequality, Debt, and the Making of the American City by Destin Jenkins. So we hope you all will join in and log on. Again, this is just getting you ready for the conference in Montgomery, Alabama, where we'll all be there enjoying seeing each other in person, and you can also join in virtually. So go to asala.org and log on and join in. We'll hear a few remarks from Marvin Delaney, our president. Marvin, would you like to give us a little closing remark?
Yes, let me thank the panelists and of course, definitely Ms. Williams Forson for her wonderful research that stimulated all of this discussion. I want to say something just a little crazy. The Queen died today, and Brother Kabui, you sort of put it all in perspective. She's getting all these accolades, but you and I know she was no queen to us. So anyway, let me indeed thank all of the panelists, and I hope you'll join us in Montgomery And Brother Kabui, I don't know whether you're celebrating, or shouting, or feeling, I know you're not feeling sad. You put it all in perspective with your presentation this evening. So it's very apropos. So again, thank all of the panelists. And we hope you'll join us next week. And obviously, again, in Montgomery. Thank you.
Take care. Thanks, LaShawn.
Thank you.